It was supposed to be a simple flight. 3 hours. One layover. A one-way ticket tucked into the front pocket of a diaper bag that was already falling apart at the zipper. She had packed it the night before while both babies slept, sitting on the floor of an apartment she was leaving forever, folding tiny onesies and trying not to cry into them. She was 31 years old, the mother of 14-month-old twins. And she was doing what a lot of people never talk about out loud. She was starting over from zero. Alone, with 2 people who depended entirely on her and had absolutely no idea what that pressure felt like. Her name was Lisa. Not that anyone on that plane would ever ask. She had booked the flight 3 weeks earlier when the reality of her bank account finally outran her pride. After her husband left, not with drama, not with a fight, just with a bag and an excuse and a door that closed too quietly for how much it hurt. She had tried to hold things together in that apartment for 7 months. She worked from home, ordered the cheapest groceries she could find, and told herself she was fine every single morning while strapping 2 babies into a double stroller that had a broken wheel she never got around to fixing. But fine has a shelf life, and hers had expired. So she called her mother in Portland, bought the ticket, and told herself the hard part was over. She had no idea the hard part was standing right at the gate, wearing 2 baby carriers and dragging a stroller that kept veering left. The airport alone was overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the security line where she had to collapse the stroller, hold both babies, remove her shoes, and reassemble everything on the other side, while a line of impatient travelers sighed behind her. By the time she found her gate, she was already sweating through her jacket, and one of the twins had pulled her ponytail loose and was chewing on her hair. She boarded early because they offered pre-boarding for passengers with small children, which felt like the only mercy the day had offered her. She got settled into her row, buckled one baby in her lap, wedged the other against the window with a rolled-up jacket, and took one slow breath. Just one. That was all she got. Because the moment the plane began to fill up, and the engines hummed to life, and the cabin doors sealed shut, something shifted in both babies at once. It was like they felt the pressure change. Or maybe they just sensed their mother's tension the way babies always seem to, and they both started crying. Not a little fuss, not a soft whimper that a snack could fix. A full, red-faced, back-arching cry that bounced off every surface of that cabin and turned every single head in their direction. Lisa did everything. She bounced them. She offered bottles. She sang under her breath, barely audible over the engines. She switched them from arm to arm until her shoulders burned. She whispered apologies to the air in front of her because she didn't know who exactly to apologize to, but it felt like everyone. And that's when it started. A man 2 rows ahead turned around slowly, the way people do when they want you to know they're annoyed without technically doing anything wrong. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her travel companion and said something behind her hand, and they both glanced over. Lisa saw it. She always saw it. And then the flight attendant, young, a little sharp around the edges, clearly not having a great day herself, walked over and crouched down slightly and said, in a tone just loud enough to carry, "Is there anything you can do to keep them a little calmer?" Not offered help. Not asked if she needed anything. Just that question, wrapped in that tone, in front of a quiet cabin that was very much listening. The words landed like a slap. Lisa's jaw tightened. Her eyes went hot and glassy, but she refused, absolutely refused, to cry in front of these people. She had cried enough in private. She nodded at the flight attendant and said, "I'm trying." And those 2 words carried about 7 months of weight inside them. The babies kept crying. The passengers kept glancing. And Lisa sat there in seat 14A, holding 2 screaming toddlers at 30,000 feet, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life, completely unaware that the man sitting right next to her was about to changed the entire rest of that flight. The man in seat 14B hadn't said a word since the plane took off. He had his jacket folded neatly on his lap, a paperback book open in his hands, and the kind of stillness about him that you don't see very often anymore. Not the uncomfortable kind. Not the kind that meant he was ignoring everything around him, but the kind that comes from someone who has lived long enough to know which battles are worth entering and which ones just need a moment before they reveal themselves. He was somewhere in his late 50s, with gray at his temples and the sort of quiet face that doesn't give much away until it does. He had been watching, not in the intrusive way the others were watching, but in the calm, assessing way of someone trying to understand what's actually needed. And after the flight attendant walked away, and Lisa sat there holding both babies with her jaw tight and her eyes glassy and her whole body radiating the kind of exhaustion that goes all the way to the bone, he closed his book. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't clear his throat or tap her on the shoulder or say anything that would draw more attention their way. He simply closed the book, set it on the tray table, and turned toward her with an expression that had no pity in it, and that was the first thing that made her actually look at him. People had been giving her pity faces for 7 months. The tilted head, the soft eyes, the "oh, you poor thing" energy that somehow always made her feel worse instead of better. This man didn't have that. He just looked at her like she was a person in a situation, and he was another person who might be useful in it. He said, "Which one do you want me to take?" Lisa blinked. She genuinely thought she had misheard him over the engine noise and the crying. She said, "Sorry?" And he nodded toward the twins, calm as anything, and said it again. "Which one do you want me to take? You handle one, I'll handle the other. It's easier that way." For a second, she just stared at him, because that is the honest reaction when a complete stranger on an airplane offers to hold your child. Your brain needs a moment to process whether this is real or whether exhaustion has started making her hear things. But there was nothing strange or uncomfortable about the way he said it. It wasn't a performance. He wasn't looking around to see if anyone noticed how generous he was being. He was just waiting, practically, for her to make a decision, the way someone offers to carry a heavy box. Not because it's heroic, but because they're right there and it makes obvious sense. Lisa handed him the boy. She didn't even fully decide to. It just happened. Because her arms were tired and her instincts, underneath all the fear, recognized something steady in him. And what happened next was the thing she would think about for a long time afterward. He took the baby, her son, 14 months old and fully mid-meltdown. And he didn't hold him out awkwardly at arm's length the way people do when they're trying but don't really know what they're doing. He brought him in close, turned him so the baby was facing outward against his chest, with one big hand spread across the little belly, and he started humming. Not a song exactly, just a low, steady sound, almost like a vibration more than a melody. And the baby, her son, who had been screaming for the better part of 20 minutes, slowed down. Not immediately, but in stages, the way a storm breaks. First the pitch dropped. Then the crying went from frantic to tired. Then the little body, which had been rigid and arched with frustration, softened and leaned back. And within maybe 4 minutes, the boy's eyes were closed and his breathing had gone heavy and slow, and he was completely, peacefully asleep against the chest of a man whose name his mother didn't even know yet. Lisa watched all of this happen with an expression she couldn't control. Somewhere between disbelief and the specific kind of emotion that hits you when someone helps you in a way you didn't know you needed until it was happening. She looked at the man and said, "How did you do that?" And he smiled, just slightly, and said, 30 years working with kids. You pick some things up. He didn't say it to impress her. He said it the way people explain things when they're just being honest. And just like that, without any announcement or drama. The two of them settled into the strange, unspoken teamwork of strangers who have silently agreed to get through something together. There is a particular kind of comfort that comes from someone simply showing up and staying, not making a big deal out of it, not waiting to be thanked, just being present and useful in the quiet, unglamorous way that actually matters. That was what the next 2 hours felt like. Not magical, not cinematic, just two strangers on an airplane figuring out a rhythm together, the way people do when the situation asks it of them and they're both decent enough to say yes. The baby boy stayed asleep against the man's chest for a solid stretch. And in that window, Lisa was able to give her full attention to her daughter, who had calmed down from screaming but was still fussy in that low-grade, unpredictable way that keeps a mother's nervous system permanently on alert. 1 minute fine. The next minute tipping toward another meltdown for no visible reason. Lisa nursed her, which helped, and the man beside her shifted slightly to give her privacy without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it, which she noticed and appreciated more than she could say. When the boy stirred and started to fuss again, the man stood up without being asked and walked him slowly up the aisle and back, swaying just a little with each step. And the baby quieted almost immediately, because motion does something to small children that nothing else can replicate. It reminds them of being carried before they were born. Some deep animal comfort that bypasses all the noise in their little nervous systems. A few passengers glanced up as he passed and then looked away, and not a single one of them said anything unkind, which felt different from the energy in that cabin 20 minutes earlier. At some point, the daughter fell asleep too. Finally, both babies out at the same time in what felt like a small miracle. And Lisa sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and her eyes closed and just breathed. The man settled back into his seat and picked his book back up, but didn't really read it. And after a minute or two, the quiet between them shifted from practical to something a little more open. The way it does when two people have just done something together, and the doing of it has made them less like strangers. She asked him what he meant by 30 years working with kids. And he told her, not in a braggy way, not with a list of credentials, just plainly, that he had spent most of his career as a pediatric nurse, that he had held a lot of scared and hurting children in his time, and that you learn pretty quickly what they need, which is almost always the same thing regardless of what's wrong with them: warmth, pressure, rhythm, and the sense that the person holding them is not afraid. He said that last part quietly, almost to himself, and Lisa felt it land somewhere inside her because she understood without him saying, so that he wasn't just talking about babies. She told him a little about herself, not everything, but enough: the move, the divorce, the apartment she had left behind, the fact that she was heading to her mother's house, not as a visit but as a retreat, as an admission that she had tried her hardest and the hardest hadn't been quite enough, at least not for right now. She said she felt like she was failing, and he shook his head, not dismissively but firmly, and he said, "Moving your kids somewhere safer when you can't hold things together alone isn't failing. That's exactly what a good mother does." She didn't respond to that. She looked out the window for a moment and pressed her lips together, and he let her have the silence, which was the right thing to do. He told her a little about himself too. She learned he was on his way home to Atlanta, that he had just attended a funeral for someone he loved, that the trip had been heavy in the way that certain trips are, the kind you don't fully process until you're back in your own space with the door closed. He said it without asking for sympathy, just as a fact. The way people share things when they've already crossed some invisible line from stranger to something else. She looked at him then with different eyes, realizing that this man who had just spent 2 hours helping her through one of the hardest travel days of her life was himself carrying something, was himself tired and grieving, and had chosen to reach toward her anyway. And somehow that made his kindness feel bigger, not smaller, because it hadn't come from a place of overflow. It had come from a place of choice. It is a strange and quietly powerful thing. The way one person's decency can change the temperature of an entire room. Not through a speech, not through any grand gesture, just through the simple act of choosing to be kind in a visible way, because people watch, even when they pretend not to. And what they see other people do has a way of nudging something loose inside them that was already there, just waiting for permission. That is exactly what began to happen in that cabin somewhere over the Midwest. In the slow, unremarkable way that real things tend to happen, not all at once. Not with any fanfare, just a gradual, almost invisible shift in the air that Lisa felt before she could actually point to what had changed. The first sign came from the least expected direction. The teenage boy sitting across the aisle, maybe 15 or 16. The kind of age where you're usually too self-conscious to do anything that might look uncool in public, had been sneaking glances at the twins for a while. At some point during the flight, when Lisa's daughter woke back up and was sitting alert in her mother's lap, looking around with those big, curious baby eyes that take in everything like the world is still entirely new. The boy leaned across the aisle slightly and made a face, not a mean face, just a silly one. The kind where you cross your eyes and puff your cheeks out. Completely ridiculous. The sort of thing that only works on people under the age of 2. The baby girl stared at him for one long second and then burst into a laugh, a full, genuine, baby belly laugh that is arguably one of the best sounds a human being can produce. And it rang out across the nearby rows like something breaking open in a good way. A few people looked up and smiled before they even realized they were doing it. The boy grinned, delighted with himself, and did it again. And the baby laughed again. And just like that, there was a small pocket of warmth in that cabin that hadn't existed 5 minutes earlier. Then the man from row 12, the one who had turned around early in the flight with that slow, pointed look of irritation, the one whose expression had made Lisa want to disappear into her seat. That man stood up and made his way back down the aisle. Lisa saw him coming and felt her shoulders tense without meaning to. That automatic bracing that you develop when you've already been made to feel like a problem once and you're waiting for it to happen again. But he stopped at her row and stood there for a second, looking slightly awkward. The way people do when they're attempting something they don't have a lot of practice at. And he held out a small pack of crackers, the kind the airline sells, still sealed, clearly from his own bag, and he said, "I thought maybe the little ones might want something to snack on," and then almost immediately added, "Mine were the same way at that age." Flights were a nightmare, with a short, rueful laugh that was nothing like the face he had been wearing an hour ago. Lisa took the crackers and said, "Thank you," and meant it, not because crackers were what she needed, but because of what the offering actually was, which was an apology in the only language some people know how to speak. He went back to his seat, and she held the little packet in her hand for a moment before tucking it into the diaper bag. And something in her chest that had been tight since before she even got to the airport loosened by a fraction. Even the flight attendant came back. The same one who had crouched beside her earlier with that clipped, carrying tone that had silenced the cabin. She returned quieter this time, no audience energy about her. Just a cup of water and a small bag of pretzels set on the tray table without a word. And then, almost as an afterthought, a soft, "Let me know if you need anything else, okay?" That was so different in its texture from what she had said before that Lisa wondered what had happened in between, whether she had felt the shift in the cabin too, or whether she had seen the man in 14B walking the baby up the aisle and felt something correct itself inside her. Maybe both. Maybe neither. Maybe people are just more complicated than the worst moment you catch them in, which is something worth remembering. None of it was dramatic. Nobody stood up and made a speech. Nobody posted anything or filmed anything or performed their goodness for an audience. It was all small, small gestures, small words, small moments of one human being acknowledging another, and yet the cumulative weight of it was enormous. At least Elisa, who was sitting in the middle of it and feeling it land one quiet piece at a time. Because when you have been made to feel invisible in the bad way, like a burden, like something to be tolerated, the experience of being seen in the good way, even by strangers, even briefly, even through something as small as a pack of crackers or a silly face or a cup of water, placed gently on a tray, is something to you that is genuinely hard to put into words. It doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change the circumstances that put you on that plane in the first place. But it reminds you that the world contains more than the worst version of itself. And sometimes that reminder is exactly enough to get you to the next hour. The plane began its descent into Portland the way all flights do, with that gentle dip that wakes the sleeping and makes the babies stir, with the overhead announcement about seat belts and tray tables, with the sound of people shifting and rustling and starting to gather themselves back into the versions of themselves they'd be once the doors opened. Lisa felt it in her stomach, that drop, and it wasn't entirely from the altitude change. It was the particular anxiety of arrival, not the kind that comes from danger, but the kind that comes from significance. From knowing that when you walk off this plane, you are stepping into a life that looks very different from the one you stepped away from, and that there is no version of that which doesn't hurt at least a little, no matter how necessary it is. Both babies were awake now, drowsy and warm and manageable in the way that only happens after they've cried themselves out and slept it off. And she was holding them both, one on each knee. And for the first time since the flight began, she felt like she actually had a handle on things, not because anything had been solved, but because she had made it through. Which is its own kind of victory when you're running on as little as she was. The man beside her had put his book away and was gathering his own things with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned traveler. And she watched him for a moment and felt the strange mix of emotions that comes with knowing you're about to say goodbye to someone who showed up for you in a way you didn't ask for and couldn't have anticipated and will probably never forget. She wanted to say something that matched the size of what he had done, but the right words for that are almost impossible to find in real time. Standing in an airplane aisle with a baby on your hip, and the gate still 10 minutes away. When the plane touched down and the cabin filled with the sound of seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins opening, he stood up and didn't hesitate. He reached up and pulled her bag down from the bin before she could even figure out the logistics of doing it herself while holding 2 children. And then he helped her get the babies into the carrier, adjusting the strap on one side without being asked because he could see it was twisted. And he carried the diaper bag off the plane and down the jet bridge without making it feel like charity, just like the obvious next thing to do. When they came through the gate doors, her mother was there, standing right at the barrier with her coat still on from rushing in from the parking garage, scanning the faces coming through until she found her daughters. And the look on her face when she did, that particular expression that only a mother has, that mixture of relief and heartbreak and love so big, it doesn't fit neatly into any one emotion, broke something open in Lisa that she had been keeping sealed for a long time. She walked into her mother's arms and the babies were scooped up, and she stood there for a moment with her face pressed into a familiar shoulder and finally let herself cry. Not the hot, ashamed tears she had been fighting back on the plane, but something older and deeper and more necessary. The kind of crying that is actually the body releasing something it was never meant to carry alone. She pulled herself together after a moment and turned to find the man standing a few feet back, giving her the space of it, the diaper bag set neatly at her feet. She reached for his arm before he could step away. She tried to speak and couldn't quite get the words organized. And he shook his head gently in the way that meant she didn't have to. And he took her hand and held it for just a second and said, You did good up there. Both of you." He glanced at the twins when he said it, and then he smiled. A real one. Unhurried, and he turned and walked into the crowd and was gone. Absorbed into the stream of travelers heading to baggage, claim and connecting gates, and all the separate lives that briefly shared the same air and then scatter again. She never got his last name. She never found him online. She tried once, the way you do when someone leaves an impression that doesn't fade. But a first name and a city, and a general description of a kind man on a plane is not enough to find a person in the world. And maybe that was all right. Maybe some people are meant to pass through your life cleanly, without the complication of a follow-up. 6 months later, settled into a new routine at her mother's house. The baby's walking now, her own footing slowly returning. She wrote about it, just for herself at first, in a note on her phone. The way you write things down so you don't lose them. Then she shaped it into something longer and posted it. Almost didn't. Changed her mind twice and hit publish at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night without expecting much. By morning, it had been shared thousands of times. People wrote to her from everywhere, other single mothers, other strangers who had once been helped on planes or trains or in grocery store parking lots. People who had been the stranger who helped and never knew if it mattered. What struck her most, reading through the responses, was how many people said some version of the same thing, that they had been in a moment like hers, public and struggling and bracing for judgment, and that one person choosing kindness had changed the entire shape of the day. Not their life, not their problems, just the day. As she thought about the man on the plane, who had been grieving his sister and was tired in his own deep way, and who had looked at a woman holding 2 crying babies and decided that his own heaviness was not a reason to withhold what he had to give, and she thought that might be the truest thing she had ever witnessed. That kindness is not something you produce when everything is fine. It is something you choose, specifically, when everything is not.
Thanks for watching my video. Like, subscribe and share.